first read Little Women. Is this okay with the mic? Yeah. I first read Little Women when I was about 10. Like many women, I always wanted to be Jo. I was also the family rebel, the one who could never mind her manners, sit up straight, the one who was often angry, the one who was always pretending to be a horse when the time came to put on a dress and curtsy to Mrs. Frothingham. Most of the girls in the books I read and in the life I led were ladylike and pretty. Successful girls were thin and loved to wear nice clothes that always looked wonderful on them. On me, clothes always looked as if they belonged to someone else, and they often got torn and dirty on my excursions through the fields and woods around our house. Jo March offered me a different kind of image, a new definition of what it meant to be a girl. Instead of a graceful young lady who always minded her manners and knew that her future lay in loving the right man, she was an outspoken, clumsy girl who turned down the right man even though he loved her. Reading Little Women again now, I can see how profoundly the book influenced me, as a woman, but even more than that, as a writer. Without intending to, Louisa May Alcott invented a new way to write about the ordinary lives of women and to tell stories that are usually heard in kitchens or bedrooms. She made literature out of the kind of conversations women have while doing the dishes together or taking care of their children. It was in Little Women that I learned that domestic details can be the subject of art, that small things in a woman's life, cooking, the trimming of a dress or hat, quiet talk, can be just as important a subject as a great whale or a scarlet letter. Little Women gave my generation of women permission to write about our daily lives. In many ways, even though it's a novel in tone and voice, it's the precursor of the modern memoir, the book that gives voice to people who have traditionally kept quiet. In fact, the foundation of the American memoir can be found in Alcott's masterpiece and in that of her friend Henry David Thoreau. Alcott's greatest work was so powerful because it was about ordinary things. I think that's why it felt ordinary even as she wrote it. She transformed the lives of women into something worthy of literature. Without even meaning to, Alcott exalted the everyday in women's lives and gave it greatness.
And now, as you end the book in the final chapter, in my opinion, and the opinion of a lot of the students who discussed it with me, you enact what you just said.
Right. Now I'm doing it. And it's just what I said extemporaneously, too. So now you've heard it. It must be true, right? Twice it's true. I had been reading about, I always like to know how long a person's going to read. So this is a little more than 2 pages. I'd been reading about and it's the last chapter of the book, and let me say, for a long time, it was the first chapter of the book. A very long time. And possibly, I mean, this goes to me not knowing what I'm doing. I see now, thanks to Al, that it belongs at the end, after I talk about the importance of domestic detail. But it's possible, and this is a terrible confession, that I moved it to the back because of all that yakky yak about how terrible authorial intrusion is. And it's possible that I didn't want to lead with it because I was afraid they would say, there she goes again. The queen of oversharing. That's what they call me when they're being mean. There's a guy at the Boston Globe who just goes after me about every 5 years, and that's his. So it may be that I moved it to the back for the wrong reasons, but it's certainly, this is where it belongs. Thank you, Al.
You're welcome.
You know, I do things for the wrong reasons, and Al makes them look good.
It's my job.
An amazing thing. I had been reading about Concord, Massachusetts in the 1840s and 50s for about a year before I first managed to actually visit. I had been in Concord before as a child in the 1950s and visiting a friend in the 1970s. I'd read many books about the Concord writers and their American Renaissance. A few years ago, these two things, the place and the literature, began to knit themselves together in my imagination. Pretty soon I was obsessed with Concord in the 1850s. I lived there in my mind as much as I could between taking my son to school and teaching and writing. Every evening I would retreat to my Concord, reliving the sorrows of the Emerson household or the dizzy hopes of Louisa May Alcott. When I finally got there, it was a hot August day, and I had a car full of children, my son, my daughter, and a friend, Griffin, his name is, as well as 2 panting dogs, a corgi and a dachshund. My brain simmered as I drove down Route 2 from New York en route to New Hampshire for my first view of the place I had been living in, my imagination. What a shock. Somehow I had thought I would be driving into the 19th century. Instead of the few shops along the mill dam and the clip-clop of horses' hooves, I was halted a mile out of town by a traffic jam. By the time I got to Monument Square, the occupants of the car were in high rebellion. There was nowhere to park. One of the dogs started whining. When I finally found a parking space, everyone piled out of the car onto the molten pavement and into the crowds of unfriendly tourists. Where were the Alcotts? Where was Thoreau, who should have been shambling down Main Street with a walking stick? There was nothing to see and everything to buy. Unfamiliar with this town, which in reality seemed as foreign to me as the most remote corners of the earth, I was unable to find an ice cream store or a bathroom or any of the other amenities which are required by children on long trips. We piled back into the car and drove toward the crossroads where American literature was written. At least in front of the Emerson house, there was somewhere to park and let the dogs out on the grass, but no one was happy. The possibility of going inside the Emerson house seemed remote with 3 children and 2 dogs, and I began to lose my hold on the delicious small town of my memory. Where was the Concord I had hoped to write about? Back in the car, now crowded with children and dogs complaining vocally, I announced that we would at least go and see the Old North Bridge. "It's your heritage," I commanded. I had lost my book, but I wasn't about to lose this battle. At the Old Manse, the parking lot was crammed with school buses. Crowds of children and families filled the path to the Old North Bridge. My children refused to get out of the car. It took a month to reassemble in my imagination the images of my Concord, the Concord where Hawthorne and Thoreau rode the ice floe, and where Emerson was jealous of Hawthorne. At first, every visit to modern Concord dissipated my book, which had to be reassembled with the library I was building at home in New York. Staying at the Best Western built on a pasture near Fairhaven Bay and breakfasting with businessmen, the Concord I loved seemed worlds away. But as the months and years went by, I began to have a few moments that matched. One February, and boy, perseverance is a good thing to have. Stubbornness. One February, staying at the Colonial Inn, Shattuck's store to the Alcotts, when the town was empty, I had a sense that I had gone back in time. Looking out my narrow window at Monument Square toward the steep white spire of the Unitarian Church, I could almost see Hawthorne and Margaret Fuller with their backs to me as they walked and talked on their way to the Emerson house. Her skirts billowed out in the breeze. He leaned over to hear her better. As they passed the end of the square, they both burst out laughing at some private joke. One evening, walking down the fields below the Old Manse, where the mossy bank drops into the river, I just missed Hawthorne on his way down from the house to take a cooling swim. In a canoe on the Sudbury and Assabet rivers one summer afternoon, I saw something Thoreau would have loved. Gliding up past the meadows where the smells of grass and wildflowers lay in the still air, a friend and I came upon a great horned owl that appeared to be wounded. The large owl was trying to fly and failing, splashing with a whoosh down into the water after a few feet. As we approached as silently as possible, the owl's attempts became more desperate. Each time the owl took off, he cleared the water by less and less, until the bird was actually swimming a kind of painful breaststroke in front of the canoe. As our eyes adjusted, we saw that the owl was not wounded. He was holding his dinner, a muskrat, and the weight of the rat was keeping the bird from flying. Suddenly the owl dropped the rat, glided upward, and sat on a dead log in perfect camouflage to let us pass. Later, when we paddled back downstream toward home, the owl was enjoying his dinner in the tall reeds at the side of the river. I began to see that the sepia tones of the Concord of my imagination were still there, hidden under the bright colors of the stores and cars of modern-day Concord. It was a subtler place and sometimes hard to find. In the recreation of Emerson's study at the Concord Museum, I felt it for a moment, and one afternoon on the shores of Walden Pond, slowly the book began to reassemble itself, and I began to see the Alcotts arriving in front of the house where the Middlesex Hotel once stood, and the Hawthorne family leaving the Old Manse in a carriage with nowhere to go. This book is taken from that imagined landscape, the landscape of a Concord where 5 people tangled with each other and the world and wrote the books that still inspire us. It is my hope that this story will serve as an introduction to that landscape and that the reader will come to love it as I have. Aww.